In ancient Israel, a woman made a promise so desperate, so extreme, that it would change the course of a nation forever. But before she could fulfill that promise, she would have to endure years of torment that would break most people. This is the story of Hannah. In the hill country of Ephraim, during the time when judges ruled over Israel, there lived a man whose name was Elkanah. He was the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. This man had established his household in Ramah, a city that would become known for its significance in Israel's history. But Elkanah's household harbored a secret pain that threatened to tear his family apart. Elkanah had taken 2 wives, as was the custom in those days when the survival of family lines was paramount. His first wife was named Hannah, whose name meant grace or favor. She was a woman of remarkable beauty, both in countenance and in spirit, possessing a gentle nature that drew people to her. Yet despite her many virtues, Hannah carried a burden that weighed heavily upon her heart day and night. The second wife was Peninnah, whose name meant pearl or coral. Unlike Hannah, Peninnah had been blessed with the ability to bear children. The Lord had opened her womb, and she had given Elkanah several sons and daughters. In a society where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to produce offspring, particularly male heirs, Peninnah held a position of honor and security within the household. But Hannah remained barren. The Lord had closed her womb, and no amount of prayer, no offerings, no remedies suggested by the wise women of the community could change this reality. Month after month, year after year, Hannah's arms remained empty while her heart grew heavy with longing. In those days, barrenness was not merely a personal disappointment. It was seen as a sign of divine displeasure, a mark of shame that followed a woman wherever she went. And Peninnah knew exactly how to use this against her. Despite this trial, Elkanah's love for Hannah never wavered. He demonstrated his affection and regard for her in tangible ways, particularly during the family's annual pilgrimage to the house of the Lord in Shiloh. This journey was not merely a religious obligation, but a celebration, a time when families would offer sacrifices and share in the peace offerings before the Lord. But what should have been a time of joy was about to become Hannah's worst nightmare. Year after year, the family would make this sacred journey. They would pack their belongings, gather their animals for sacrifice, and travel the dusty roads that led to Shiloh, where the tabernacle of the Lord stood. The tabernacle was the center of worship for all Israel, the place where the Ark of the Covenant resided, where the presence of the Almighty dwelt among his people. At Shiloh, 2 priests served before the Lord, Hophni and Phinehas, the sons of Eli. These men bore the responsibility of offering sacrifices on behalf of the people, of maintaining the sacred rituals that connected Israel to their God. Yet these priests had corrupted their sacred office. They treated the Lord's offering with contempt, taking the best portions for themselves before the sacrifice was properly offered to God. Their behavior was an abomination before the Lord, and their actions brought dishonor to the sacred service. Little did Hannah know that these corrupt priests would soon witness the most desperate prayer ever uttered in that holy place. Eli, their father, served as the high priest and judge over Israel. He was an elderly man who had served faithfully for many years, yet he had failed to restrain his sons from their wicked practices. Though he knew of their corruption, he had not taken decisive action to stop them, allowing them to continue in their sin, despite the harm they caused to the people's worship. When Elkanah's family arrived at Shiloh each year, they would participate in the sacrificial meal. This was a time of joy and celebration, when families would feast together on the portions of meat that were returned to them after the sacrifice. It was during these meals that the painful dynamics of Elkanah's household became most apparent. And this is where Peninnah would strike with devastating cruelty. Elkanah would distribute portions of meat to his family members according to custom. To Peninnah and all her sons and daughters, he would give their appropriate portions. But to Hannah, he would give a double portion, because he loved her deeply and wanted to honor her despite her barrenness. This gesture, meant to show his love and support, served as a constant reminder of what Hannah lacked. The double portion did not go unnoticed by Peninnah, who saw in it both a challenge to her own position and an opportunity to assert her superiority. Because the Lord had given her children while denying them to Hannah, Peninnah would provoke Hannah mercilessly. She would make cutting remarks about Hannah's childless state, remind her of her failure to fulfill a woman's primary role, and suggest that surely God was punishing her for some hidden sin. But the worst was yet to come. Year after year, the cruelty would escalate. This provocation was not an occasional occurrence, but a regular pattern that repeated year after year. Peninnah's cruel words would pierce Hannah's heart like arrows, each comment a fresh wound that reopened old pain. The yearly pilgrimage, which should have been a time of spiritual renewal and joy, became instead a season of torment for Hannah. The emotional toll of this constant provocation was devastating. Hannah would lose her appetite, unable to eat the festive meal that should have been a source of celebration. She would weep uncontrollably, her tears flowing like rivers as she contemplated her empty womb and empty arms. The other families at the feast would notice her distress, and their sympathetic glances only added to her sense of isolation and shame. Elkanah, observing his beloved wife's anguish, would attempt to console her. He would remind her of his love, questioning why she wept and why she refused to eat. In his own way, he tried to convince her that his love should be sufficient, that she should find comfort in their relationship even without children. Yet despite his good intentions, he could not truly understand the depth of Hannah's longing or the societal pressures that made her barrenness so painful. But Hannah had reached her breaking point. What she would do next would shock everyone. The situation reached a breaking point during one particular year's pilgrimage. The family had completed their sacrifice and had gathered for the communal meal. The familiar pattern began again. Peninnah's provocative comments, Hannah's tears, the heavy atmosphere of tension that settled over their portion of the feast. But this time, something stirred within Hannah that had never stirred before. Something that would change everything. Rising from her place at the meal, Hannah walked away from the gathering. Her steps led her toward the tabernacle of the Lord, toward the place where the presence of the Almighty dwelt among His people. She was no longer content to suffer in silence, no longer willing to accept her situation without taking action. The pain and longing that had built up over years of disappointment now drove her to seek the Lord with an intensity she had never before experienced. But what happened next at the tabernacle would be so intense, so desperate, that even the high priest would mistake her for a drunk woman. The tabernacle complex was a place of awesome reverence. The outer court contained the bronze altar where sacrifices were offered, and the bronze laver where priests washed before their service. Beyond that stood the holy place, and beyond that, the most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant resided. Common people like Hannah could not enter these sacred spaces, but they could pray in the outer areas, bringing their petitions before the Lord. Hannah found herself a place near the entrance to the tabernacle, where she could pour out her heart before the Lord. The weight of years of disappointment, the constant provocation from Peninnah, the well-meaning but inadequate comfort from Elkanah, and the deep maternal longing that consumed her, all combined to create a prayer of unprecedented intensity. She began to pray with a fervor that consumed her entire being. Her lips moved rapidly as she poured out her heart to the Lord, but no sound emerged from her throat. The words were spoken in the depths of her spirit, a silent conversation between her soul and the Almighty. Her body swayed with the intensity of her emotion, her hands gestured as if she were pleading with a visible presence, and tears streamed down her face as she wrestled with God in prayer. In her prayer, Hannah made a vow that would change the course of her life and the history of Israel. A promise so extreme, so sacrificial, that it would test the very depths of a mother's love. She promised the Lord that if He would remember her and give her a son, she would dedicate that child to His service for all the days of his life. She vowed that no razor would ever come upon his head, marking him as a Nazirite from birth, one set apart for special service to God. This was not a casual promise made in the heat of emotion. Hannah was offering to give back to God the very thing she most desperately wanted. She was willing to sacrifice her own maternal desires for the greater purpose of serving the Lord. The child she longed to hold and raise would be given to the Lord's service, spending his life in the tabernacle rather than in her home. But someone was watching her, and what he assumed would lead to public humiliation. As Hannah continued in this intense prayer, she remained unaware that she was being observed. Eli, the high priest, was sitting on his chair beside the doorpost of the Lord's house, watching the worshippers who came to pray. His aged eyes fell upon this woman, who appeared to be in great distress, her lips moving rapidly though no sound could be heard. From Eli's perspective, Hannah's behavior appeared strange and inappropriate. Her swaying motions, her silent but animated conversation, and her obvious emotional state led him to a conclusion that revealed both his own spiritual dullness and the corruption of the times. He assumed that she was intoxicated, that she had drunk too much wine during the sacrificial feast and was now making a spectacle of herself at the sacred place. What happened next would either crush Hannah's spirit completely or change everything. Eli's reaction to what he perceived as drunkenness was swift and harsh. He approached Hannah with rebuke, commanding her to stop her disgraceful behavior and rid herself of her wine. His words were sharp and condemning, adding yet another burden to Hannah's already heavy heart. Here, at the very place where she had come seeking comfort from the Lord, she found only additional condemnation from his representative. Hannah's response to Eli's accusation revealed both her character and her spiritual condition. She did not respond with anger or indignation, though she would have been justified in doing so. Instead, she spoke with respect and honesty, addressing Eli as her Lord and explaining her true situation. She told him that she was not drunk, but was rather a woman deeply troubled in spirit, pouring out her soul before the Lord. She explained that she had come to this place not in celebration but in desperation, seeking the Lord's intervention in her life. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief, bringing her troubles to the only one who could provide relief. Her behavior, which had appeared inappropriate to Eli, was actually the expression of a heart seeking God with complete honesty and vulnerability. Hannah's explanation opened Eli's eyes to his error in judgment. The high priest, who should have been able to discern the spiritual condition of those who came to worship, had completely misread the situation. Her words convicted him of his hasty conclusion and stirred something within him that had perhaps been dormant for too long. What he said next would either seal her fate or unlock a miracle. Eli's response to Hannah's explanation marked a turning point in their encounter. Where he had begun with rebuke and condemnation, he now spoke with blessing and encouragement. He told her to go in peace, and then he uttered words that would prove to be prophetic. He prayed that the God of Israel would grant her the petition she had made to him. These words from the high priest carried special weight and authority. In Israel's culture, the blessing of a priest was considered to have particular power and significance. Eli's prayer on Hannah's behalf was not merely a kind wish, but a formal intercession that invoked God's favor upon her request. The effect of Eli's blessing upon Hannah was immediate and remarkable. The woman who had come to the tabernacle with a heavy heart and tear-stained face now experienced a transformation that was visible to all who saw her. She thanked Eli for his kindness and expressed her hope that she would find favor in his sight. Hannah then returned to her family, but she was not the same woman who had left them in distress. The burden that had weighed upon her for so many years had been lifted, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she had cast her burden upon the Lord and received assurance that he had heard her prayer. She was able to eat the meal that had been impossible to consume earlier, and her face no longer bore the marks of despair. But would God truly answer her desperate prayer? The test of faith was just beginning. Early the next morning, the family rose and worshipped before the Lord once more, before returning to their home in Ramah. The journey home was different from any they had taken before. Hannah traveled with a sense of peace and anticipation that had been foreign to her for years. She had left her burden at the tabernacle, and now she waited with faith for the Lord to fulfill his promise. The answer to Hannah's prayer came in the most natural and beautiful way. The Lord remembered her, just as Eli had prophesied. In the course of time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. The child who had been promised in prayer became a reality in her arms. The womb that had been closed for so many years was opened, and the woman who had been called barren became a mother. But now came the ultimate test of her faith. Would she keep her impossible promise? Hannah named her son Samuel, which meant heard by God. The name was a constant reminder of the Lord's faithfulness in answering her prayer, a testimony to his power to transform impossible situations. Every time she spoke her son's name, she was reminded that God had heard her desperate plea and had responded with grace and mercy. The birth of Samuel brought joy not only to Hannah but to the entire household. Elkanah rejoiced in his wife's happiness and in the son who would carry on his family line. Even Peninnah's provocations ceased, for Hannah now held in her arms the answer to years of longing and prayer. The child who had been promised to God before his birth became the center of Hannah's world. Yet even as Hannah delighted in her son, she did not forget the vow she had made in the tabernacle. The promise to dedicate Samuel to the Lord's service was not forgotten in the joy of motherhood. She had asked God for this child with the understanding that he would be given back to God's service, and she remained faithful to that commitment. When the time came for the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah made a decision that demonstrated her faithfulness to her vow. She chose to remain at home with Samuel rather than make the journey with her husband and the rest of the family. She explained to Elkanah that she would wait until the child was weaned before bringing him to the house of the Lord, where he would remain for the rest of his life. But could any mother really go through with such a sacrifice? The clock was ticking. This period of waiting was both precious and bittersweet for Hannah. She treasured every moment with her son, knowing that their time together would be limited. She nursed him, taught him, loved him, and prepared him for the life of service that awaited him. Every day was a gift to be savored, every milestone a memory to be cherished. Samuel grew and thrived under his mother's care. Hannah poured into him not only her love but also her faith, teaching him about the Lord who had heard her prayer and granted her petition. She prepared him for the life he would lead, instilling in him the values and character that would serve him well in his calling. When Samuel was weaned, typically around 3 years of age, the time came for Hannah to fulfill her vow. This was perhaps the most difficult moment of her life, harder even than the years of barrenness and provocation. She had to voluntarily give up the child she had longed for, the answer to her prayers, the joy of her heart. What happened next would either break her completely or reveal the most extraordinary faith ever witnessed. Hannah prepared for this final journey to Shiloh with both sorrow and determination. She gathered the offerings that would accompany Samuel's dedication, a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. These were not merely ritual requirements, but expressions of her gratitude to the Lord for his faithfulness in answering her prayer. The journey to Shiloh was unlike any other the family had made. This time, Hannah traveled not as a barren woman seeking God's intervention, but as a mother about to make the ultimate sacrifice of love. Samuel, now old enough to walk and talk, accompanied his parents, unaware that this journey would change his life forever. Upon arriving at Shiloh, the family proceeded to offer their sacrifice. The bull was slaughtered according to the prescribed rituals, and the family participated in the sacrificial meal. But the real purpose of this journey was not the routine sacrifice, but the fulfillment of Hannah's vow. After the sacrifice was completed, Hannah approached Eli with her son. The high priest, now several years older, might not have immediately recognized the woman who had stood before him in such distress years earlier. But Hannah reminded him of their previous encounter, describing how she had stood in that very place, praying for a child. Hannah's words to Eli were filled with testimony and thanksgiving. She reminded him of her desperate prayer, of his blessing upon her petition, and of God's faithfulness in answering that prayer. She presented Samuel as the living proof of God's power to hear and answer prayer, the fulfillment of divine promise. Then came the moment that Hannah had been preparing for throughout Samuel's young life, the moment that would test whether her faith was real or just empty words. She formally presented her son to the Lord, declaring that she was lending him to the Lord for all the days of his life. The language she used was significant. She was not giving him away but lending him, acknowledging that all children ultimately belong to God and are merely entrusted to their parents for a time. This act of dedication was more than a mere ceremony. It was the fulfillment of a sacred vow made in desperate circumstances. Hannah demonstrated that her faith was not merely something she expressed in times of need, but something that governed her actions, even when those actions required tremendous sacrifice. Samuel, young as he was left in the care of Eli at the tabernacle. The child who had been born in answer to prayer would now begin his life of service to the Lord. He would grow up in the sacred precincts, learning the ways of worship and service, being prepared for the great work that God had planned for his life. But no one could have predicted what this child would become. Hannah's heart was filled with both joy and sorrow as she prepared to leave her son. The joy came from seeing God's faithfulness and knowing that Samuel would be raised in the service of the Lord. The sorrow came from the natural maternal grief of separation from her beloved child. Yet her faith sustained her through this difficult moment. Before leaving Shiloh, Hannah's heart overflowed with worship and thanksgiving. The barren woman who had come to the tabernacle years earlier in desperate prayer now returned with a song of praise that would echo through the ages. Her prayer of thanksgiving revealed the depth of her spiritual maturity and her understanding of God's character. Hannah's song began with rejoicing in the Lord and in the salvation he had provided. She celebrated the strength she had found in God and the joy that had replaced her former sorrow. Her heart exulted in the Lord who had lifted her from despair to triumph, from barrenness to fruitfulness. The song continued with declarations of God's holiness and uniqueness. Hannah proclaimed that there was none holy like the Lord, no rock like their God. She acknowledged that God alone was worthy of worship and praise, that he stood apart from all other powers and authorities. Her words also contained warnings against pride and arrogance. She declared that the Lord was a God of knowledge, who weighed actions and judged hearts. Those who spoke boastfully would be humbled, while those who were humble would be exalted. This was perhaps a reflection on her own experience with Peninnah's provocations and God's ultimate vindication. Hannah's song celebrated the Lord's power to reverse human fortunes. She proclaimed that he could break the bows of the mighty while strengthening the weak, that he could fill the hungry while leaving the satisfied empty. These words reflected her own experience of transformation from barrenness to fruitfulness. The song reached its climax with declarations of God's sovereignty over all creation. Hannah proclaimed that the Lord was the one who brought death and life, who brought down to the grave and raised up again. She declared that he made poor and rich, that he humbled and exalted according to his will. Her words also contained prophetic elements, speaking of God's care for the needy and his judgment of the wicked. She proclaimed that the Lord would guard the feet of his faithful ones while silencing the wicked in darkness. These words would prove to be prophetic of the ministry her son would carry out in years to come. The song concluded with declarations of God's ultimate victory and the establishment of his kingdom. Hannah spoke of the Lord thundering from heaven, judging the ends of the earth, and giving strength to his king. These words contained messianic overtones that would find their fulfillment in the coming of the Messiah. Little did she know that her son would one day anoint the greatest king in Israel's history. After completing her song of praise, Hannah returned to her home in Ramah with Elkanah. The journey home was bittersweet, filled with the satisfaction of having fulfilled her vow, but also with the natural grief of separation from her son. Yet she carried with her the knowledge that Samuel was where God wanted him to be. Meanwhile, Samuel remained at Shiloh in the care of Eli. The young boy began his life of service in the house of the Lord, learning the routines of worship and the ways of the tabernacle. Even at his young age, he demonstrated the character and dedication that would mark his entire life. Samuel's service was a stark contrast to the behavior of Eli's own sons, Hophni and Phinehas. While they corrupted their sacred office and treated the Lord's offerings with contempt, Samuel served with integrity and devotion. The boy who had been given to the Lord in faithfulness became a model of faithful service. This contrast would soon lead to dramatic consequences that would reshape the nation. Hannah's faithfulness to her vow was rewarded in ways she could never have imagined. Each year, when she and Elkanah made their pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a little robe that she had made for him. This annual gift was her way of maintaining connection with her son and providing for his needs. These yearly visits were precious times for Hannah. She could see how Samuel was growing and developing, how he was learning to serve the Lord with dedication and skill. The child she had given to God was thriving in his calling, becoming the person God had designed him to be. But God's blessings on Hannah did not end with Samuel's birth and dedication. The Lord who had opened her womb to give her Samuel continued to bless her with additional children. She conceived and bore 3 more sons and 2 daughters, filling her home with the sound of children's voices and completing the transformation from barrenness to fruitfulness. This abundant blessing was a testimony to God's faithfulness and generosity. Hannah had given her firstborn to the Lord's service, and God had multiplied her family far beyond her original request. She had asked for 1 son, and God had given her 6 children in total. Meanwhile, Samuel continued to grow and serve at Shiloh. The boy who had been dedicated to the Lord from birth was being prepared for a ministry that would reshape the nation of Israel. Under Eli's care, he learned the ways of worship and service, but more importantly, he learned to hear the voice of the Lord. The contrast between Samuel and Eli's sons became increasingly apparent as time passed. While Hophni and Phinehas continued in their corrupt practices, bringing dishonor to the priesthood and grief to their father, Samuel served with integrity and faithfulness. The boy who had been born in answer to prayer was becoming a man of God. As Samuel grew, it became clear that the Lord was with him in a special way. His dedication to service, his integrity of character, and his spiritual sensitivity marked him as one chosen by God for great things. The child who had been given to the Lord was being prepared to lead Israel through a crucial period in its history. Hannah's story was far from over, but its central theme was complete. The barren woman who had cried out to God in desperate prayer had been heard and answered. Her faithfulness in keeping her vow had been rewarded with abundant blessing. Most importantly, through her son Samuel, she had given Israel one of its greatest leaders and prophets. But the greatest chapter of Samuel's story was yet to be written. The story of Hannah stands as a testament to the power of persistent prayer, the importance of keeping vows made to God, and the Lord's faithfulness to those who trust in Him. Her experience demonstrates that God can transform the most difficult circumstances and use them for His glory and the blessing of His people. From the depths of barrenness and despair, Hannah rose to become a mother in Israel, whose son would anoint kings and guide the nation. Her story reminds us that no situation is too desperate for God's intervention, no prayer too difficult for His power to answer, and no sacrifice too great when offered in faithful service to the Lord. The legacy of Hannah's faithfulness would continue through her son Samuel, who would become one of Israel's greatest prophets and judges. Through him, the transition from the period of judges to the monarchy would be accomplished, and the foundations would be laid for the golden age of David and Solomon. Hannah's story teaches us that God's ways are not our ways, that His timing is perfect, and that His blessings often come in ways we never expected. The woman who thought she was asking for a son was actually being prepared to give Israel a leader who would change the course of history. In the end, Hannah's faithfulness was rewarded beyond her wildest dreams. She had asked for 1 son and received 6 children. She had given her firstborn to the Lord's service and watched him become one of Israel's greatest leaders. She had experienced the transformation from barrenness to fruitfulness, from despair to joy, from emptiness to abundance. The story of Hannah reminds us that God hears the prayers of his people, that he is faithful to his promises, and that he can use even our deepest trials to accomplish his purposes. Her legacy continues to inspire believers to this day, encouraging us to bring our burdens to the Lord and trust in his perfect timing and provision. The story of Hannah, the woman whose desperate prayer, faithful vow, and sacrificial love gave Israel one of its greatest leaders and provided an eternal example of faith, perseverance, and dedication to the Lord's service. If this video has touched you, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share. And don't forget to leave a comment.